Likutei Sichos, Chelek, Yudches, Shlach, the second Sicha. It says in the Gemara about the story of the Meraglim. This is a Gemara Masechta Seita. Rabbi Yitzchak said, this thing is a tradition in our hands. It's a tradition that's handed down from our forefathers. That the Meraglim were named according to their deeds. And we don't have in our hands, in other words, we don't have available any of those interpretations except for one of them. Setur ben Michael. Sesur ben Michael was the name of that particular spy. And why was he called Sesur ben Michael? Sesur from the expression of being hidden. Sorry, I said being hidden, of demolishing. There's binyan, to build, and the opposite of binyan, of building, is stira, is taking down, demolishing. Shesosar, or contradicting in this case, that he contradicted the deeds of Hashem. And Michael, that's the word sesur from taking down, contradicting. And Michael, he's the son of Michael. In other words, Michael is here telling us the concept that he made himself mach. The word Michael has within it the word mach, which means lowly. And we're soon going to see how Rashi interprets this. Rabbi Yochanan says, we also can say one of the other Meraglim, the individual called Nachbi ben Vofsi, Nachbi the son of Vofsi. What does Nachbi mean? Nachbi from the expression of being hidden, that he hid the words of Hashem. Vofsi from the expression of jumping over, Shepiseya, that he jumped over on the midos, on the attributes of Hashem. What does this mean? So Rashi learns that when it says, when Rabbi Yitzchak said that we don't have in our hands anything but one, it means we don't know how to expound on the names of the Meraglim except for this particular individual, Sesur ben Michael. According to this, we have to say that Rabbi Yochanan, who says we also know what the allegoric meaning of the name Nachbi ben Vofsi is, in other words, there's two names that tell us a lesson. Obviously, he holds not like Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak explicitly said we only have a tradition how to expound one. But if that's the way we learn, there's going to be a few questions in this statement in the Gemara. First of all, why is it so difficult to expound and to learn in the words of the Meraglim? The deeds of the Meraglim based on their names. Still, we find that Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yochanan are both saying there's only one or two of them that we can expound. We can find relevance between the names and their deeds. Why are these names more different than any of the other names in the Torah? We find many medrashim that expound on the names of people in the Torah. Even though, says the Rebbe in square brackets, that even when you're talking about drush, even when you're talking about expounding, there are rules. You can't just come and try and create connections and drushes on things based on your imagination. There are rules. What can be expounded? How can be expounded? Nonetheless, when we're talking about drush, when we're talking about the way of this pshat, remez, drush side, right? So when we're talking about drush, which is expounding, there's what we call today, I think, poetic license. There's a much greater, much broader style of learning, because the thing that you're expounding and what you're expounding to doesn't have to be exact and literal. That's what medrash is. It's not literal, it's midrashic. So therefore, and to the extent where it says in some svarim that you can't really refute a drush. If something is a drash being expounded, okay, that's the drash, even if it doesn't fit 100% in the nuances and details of all the letters and words, but it's midrashic. But that too has its rules, of course, but it's broader. So taking that into account, and especially that we find about the story of the Meraglim, we do find about the other names of the spies in other medrashim that they are expounded on. Medrash Tanchum, very basic medrash, there's drushes for all the names. So it's how can it be that just Rabbi Yitzchak and Rab Nachman are agreeing here that there's only two Meraglim that we have drushes for? Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yochanan, sorry. So question number two is, what does it mean when Rabbi Yochanan says, we too will say that there's another spy that we can expound his name? If he's adding an additional drasha on another name, he should say, not like you say to Yitzchak, that we only have access to one drasha, we have two. or say that we can say about two. Why does he go and give this long-winded addition? He says, we too can say that there's one more, Nachmi ben Vavsi. Number three, from the fact that it seems to be arguing, right? But the language when Rabbi Yochanan, if Rabbi Yochanan were to argue, the language according to the rules of the way Gemara writes, there's a difference between Amar Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yochanan Amar. When it's Rabbi Yochanan Amar, that would be argumentative. When it's Amar Rabbi Yochanan, then he's adding, he's not arguing. So this Gemara says, Rabbi Yitzchak said, we only know one of the names to expound on. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, not Rabbi Yochanan Amar, which would be argument. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, not in an arguing way, that I have one more. But that language tells us it's not an argument. He's just adding to the words of Rabbi Yitzchak. And that's really what he says when he says, we too will say that there's one more. He doesn't argue, he says, no, there's two, not one. He says, no, we too can say that there's another one. In other words, he's trying, that language denotes, and the fact that it's Amar Rabbi Yochanan, it denotes that there's no real argument here. He's adding. Well, if that's the case, there's no argument. We have to understand. I mean, Rabbi Yochanan does say that there's two, and Rabbi Yitzchak only said there's one. So how can he say, oh, I'm saying there's another one, but I'm not arguing? What do you mean? Rabbi Yitzchak just said there's one. You're saying a second one, and you want to say you're not arguing? How's that? Fourth question here is, and this says the Rebbe V'ikar, this is a very main question. Since it says, we said that the Meraglim, the Gemara says like this, the Meraglim are all called with their names based on their deeds. They were called on those names based on their future deeds. In other words, even before Moshe Rabbeinu chose them, they had those names. And that's already a tradition. The Gemara says we have a tradition from our fathers, Mesoides Mavisenu, that the Meraglim were named based on their deeds. The deeds they didn't do yet, but this was already embedded within their names. So how did Moshe Rabbeinu choose those people? Why didn't he look into their names? We know there's a concept in Gemara, a person should check into names. Names are an indication of things. So why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu, who obviously would have had the intuition and the chokhmah to know about the names, and they already called about the names, about the negativity they did later, why doesn't Moshe Rabbeinu look into their names? 5, how does this fit with what Chazal tell us? We know the Chazal tell us that they were tzaddikim at that time when they were chosen. So it seems to be that what the Meraglim did, the source of the behavior of the Meraglim, would also be by tzaddikim. It wasn't blatant bad the way it seems. But we know that Chazal tell us they were actually good people at the time. So there needs to be some more subtle mistake that they made. Base. So it would seem that maybe we'd be able to answer the second and third question. That is it an argument or not an argument? By saying that when it says, we know that what did the Gemara say? It's a tradition that the deeds of the tzaddik, that the names of the Meraglim are for their deeds. But we only have in our hands the meaning of one of them. We could say that Yitzchak means to say that we don't have the tradition on all 12. We only got the tradition about one. Not that you can't find any other drushes, but in the tradition that was handed down from our fathers, we know that there's a tradition that explains all 12. We only got one. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan says, no, but we too can say, Taka, you're right. What we remember from the tradition from our fathers, we only have one. But we can add another one. Nachbi ben Vavsi, we too can expound on it. Yeah, but that's going to be a question, because if so, what do you mean you can expound also on Nachbi ben Vavsi? We know there's midrashim for all the names. Why only this one? Also, when we say that Yitzchak said it didn't come into our hands except one, he didn't say it's only in our hands one. Yes, brother. It says also. It sounds like this is Rabbi Yitzchak's. It sounds like Rabbi Yitzchak is saying this. There's a tradition for all the 12 names. We don't know the tradition. I can only figure out one of them. And if Rabbi Yochanan is coming to add another one, so then he's arguing. So we haven't answered anything really. Gimel. Also, we have to understand in these drushes themselves, what does it mean? Sesur b'michav, said it means that he contradicted or tore down the deeds of Hashem. How do you see in the deeds of the Meraglim that they disturbed the deeds of Hashem? So Rashi says that Sosar Dvarav, what does it mean? They took down the words. They contradicted the words, and they made, the language here is, they made the enemy of Hashem look untrue, because they came back and they gave a bad report. When we say here the enemy of Hashem, that's to use language. We don't want to say that they made Hashem. So we're using it in mirror. It's kind of a mirror language. They made Hikrish. He contradicted and made his enemy, the enemy of Hashem, really means talking about Hashem, as if badoy, as if saying untruth. However, this pirush, this explanation, we can only say according to the version in the Gemara that says Sasar Devarav. The Gemara says he contradicted his words, not the words of Hashem. But our version, the Gemara says he contradicted the deeds of Hashem. So how through contradicting what Hashem said, do you contradict the Maisa, the deeds of Hashem? The words, yes, but the Girsa version of the Gemara says contradicting the deeds of Hashem. What does that mean? So the Maharsha explains on this that the deeds of Hashem are the miracles that he had done, take them out of Egypt. And by coming, giving bad report, what they did is he learns not that they took apart or they contradicted, but they covered. He learns the Sasar as histir. They covered over the deeds of Hashem, the wondrous deeds of Exodus and so on, as if they didn't see it. He said, "No, we can't go into Israel." Hey, what about all the miracles that happened? They made it as if they covered over that fact. But that doesn't fit. This Pirish is not so, Maharsha says it, but it's not so glatic, it's not so smooth. Because the Lashon of the Gemara is not histir. It's not covered over, rather it's sasar, which is to take apart. So how did they take apart the deeds of Hashem? And actually the Maharsha himself, before he says that he means that they contradicted, he first rephrases the word sasar, and he rephrases it to be histir, as hidden, covered over the words of Hashem. But that's kind of a more of a drashic interpretation of the Gemara. It's not the simple meaning of the Gemara. Also, when we say Nachbi ben Vafsi, that Nachbi is called Vafsi because he hid the words of Hashem. Rashi says he hid his words and he didn't say the words of Hashem the way they are. We don't understand. It's not the words of Hashem that he hid and didn't say the way they are. He didn't say the report of what he saw in Israel properly. So what does it mean? He was hiding the words of Hashem. He was hiding the truth that he had seen. Third question, when we say, what is Vafsi, that he jumped over what? The midas of Hashem. Rashi says he jumped over and he didn't say the things the way they were. And he doesn't say, Rashi doesn't explain what are the midas of Hashem, the attributes of Hashem that he jumped over. The Maharsha learns in this that when it says that he hid and jumped over the attributes of Hashem, it's not talking about the way he said over what he had seen in Israel. But he says, no, they hid the words of Hashem. In other words, by the miragel, by this spy, the words of Hashem were hidden. In other words, he didn't believe. It was if it was no longer, it was hidden. It was not in a revealed way in the spy because he didn't speak from a position of faith. Hashem had said that the land is good, and by this spy, it was as if those words were hidden. And he jumped over the attributes of Hashem. What does that mean? He didn't believe in Hashem's midos and Hashem's attributes. What is Hashem's midah? That he gives good reward to those who trust him. That was as if hidden by him, invisible by him. He didn't have that belief. That's the way Maharsha learns. According to this, we have to understand what's the difference when we talk about, if you're talking about the words of Hashem that were invisible and were not believed in by this Nachbi ben Vafsi, what's the difference between Nachbi and Vafsi? In other words, this we're learning two drashas, that he hid, the words of Hashem were hidden by him, invisible by him, and he jumped over the midas of Hashem also means the same thing, that he didn't believe in what Hashem had said, that they're getting a good land. So why is there two names? What are the two nuance? What are the separate points of these Nachbi ben Vafsi? The explanation of this, says the Rabbi. Dalit. What Rabbi Yitzchak says, and we don't have in our hands except one. So what does he mean? Not that we only know how to darshan, how to make a drasha. That we don't know the drashas on all the names of the Meraglim. We only know the drasha on one of them. No, what does it mean? that the drasha and the learning, the practical application of what all the other names of the Meraglim would tell us, didn't come up biyodenu in our hands. In other words, we don't know the meaning of it, which would be relevant to us in a practical way. What do we have to learn from the names of the Meraglim? Because the drashas of the other names of the Meraglim, yes, we know that they can be expounded, but that has to do with the avodah of our forefathers. They needed to learn and know the nuances of each and every name and the specific drasha and what that drasha is telling them. Because each of the names is telling us one other point of the mistake that we have to be careful of, that they have to be careful of. So there's a Messiah from our fathers that they knew the drashas and it was relevant to them. But in our hands, we only have one. There's only one concept that we have to be careful of from this whole story of the Meraglim. And what concept is that? The recurring theme, which really sums up the sum total of the mistake of all 12. And what's relevant to us is the concept of Sesur ben Michael. We shouldn't have the contradiction of Hashem's deeds. We're going to explain what that means. And Yochanan comes and says, no, we also can learn and should learn from the name of Nachmi ben Vavsi. What's Nachmi ben Vavsi? We're going to talk about it. The Taka, the way Rabbi Yochanan is not arguing with Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yochanan is saying, yes, I agree that the when we're talking about what our forefathers needed to learn from that, they needed to learn 12. We only have to learn one aspect from that. True. However, we also need to add to that another teaching, the teaching that we can learn from Nachman Babavsi. But not the way it was by our fathers. We too have to say, Rabbi Yochanan says, Af onu neima. We too have to say, no, we have to take that for our level. So Rabbi Yitzchak was saying there's a tradition that our fathers had. The names of the Meraglim told them something. Each name told them something, but that was what was relevant for them. For us, also what is really relevant to us is one theme from all of those. All of those can be summed up in one theme. Sesur ben Michael, not to contradict the the deeds of Hashem. Rabbi Yochanan and adds, not arguing, he's saying, you're right about what we learned from them, but we too need to bring something to our Avodah that can be learned from Nachmi ben Vavsi. Stay tuned because we're going to start to explain what do we mean here. Says that Rebbe will understand all this, first explaining what is explained in many places, that the source of the sin of the Meraglim, what was it? Tzaddikim, where did they go off? Source of their sin was that they didn't want to go out of their Seder HaChaim, their pattern of life in the desert, and come to Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is a land where they have to settle. And what it says about Eretz Yisrael, they were already told, when you come to the land, you'll have to sow the land for 6 years, plant for 6 years. You have to plow, and you have to plant. You have to be involved with gashmistic things. As it says in the Lashon of Chassidus, they didn't want to lower themselves from the world of thought within the world of speech. They didn't want to come from thought to speech, and especially they didn't want to come to the world of deed. They were higher level. They were in the world of thought. Even coming down to speech was a stretch. Certainly, the world of deed was for them something they wanted to remain away from. In Avodas Hashem itself, when you talk about the difference between thought and action, it's the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. Torah is the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding, learning with intellectual understanding, with seichel and thought, and also to bring it into speech. Okay, but that's still Torah. Mitzvahs, their main thing is Maisa. So the Meraglim wanted to stay in the desert, where the main occupation of the Jews would be learning Torah. And they didn't want to go to Etzol because the main thing in Etzol is doing mitzvahs, Maisa. However, we know that Lo Hamedrash Shekal Maisa, the main thing is not the study, the main thing is the deed. The intention of Hashem's creation is to make a dira b'tachtein, to make a dwelling place in the lower worlds. And that becomes achieved mainly through the service, through the work in the lower worlds, just doing mitzvahs in the physicality of the world, physical things. That was difficult to understand. Since the Meraglim at that time were ksherim, they were kosher, they were good people, they were tzaddikim. How do you make such a how do you make such a mistake that you don't need to do the avodah of ma'aseh mitzvahs? Where's that come from? It's a big mistake. How do they make such a big mistake? And you say they're tzaddikim at that time. So we have to say that they also knew there has to be ma'aseh, and they knew the ma'aseh is the main thing. You can't just stay in the realm of the theoretical. They held that the ma'aseh of mitzvahs is enough the way it's done in the desert. Because also in the desert they did several certain mitzvahs. They also lived a physical life in the desert, and therefore they had the avodah that all the deeds that they do in the material life should be done l'shem shamayim. But they thought it's not really necessary to take that to a whole new level and be consumed with deed of mitzvahs, which would happen when they go into Eretz Yisrael. Here the Rebbe makes the mistake more subtle. It's not they fought against deed. They knew deed is, Hashem gave the Torah and said it's all about this world, right? But they wanted to resist getting fully consumed in it. And in the desert, they could have more of a light version of Ma'aseh. Says the Rebbe involved. The explanation is like this. And here, put on your thinking caps, because the Rebbe is going to give us a walk through a subtle understanding in Loi HaMedrash, in Talmud, maybe Lidei Ma'aseh. So let me just give you the background of the Gemara. The Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon and other sages were in a certain attic where it was in Lud, and they were arguing. They were having a discussion. What's the main thing? Is study more important or deed more important? Rabbi Tarfon says study is more important. Rabbi Akiva said deed is more important. I think that's the way it was. Nivnu v'gamru. All the rabbis there decided that Talmud is more important, deed is more important. Godel Talmud, study is more important because Talmud maybe lidei ma'aseh. Because Talmud learning brings to deed. And just interesting, the Gemara there gives other tries to bring other lessons. The Torah was taught before the mitzvahs were actualized. You have to learn in order to do. Pesach there says an interesting thing that yes, of course, if somebody says, should I do or learn? Well, if you don't know what to do, of course you have to learn first. You'll know what to do. But once you already know what to do, the question is, should I further learn or do? That can become a question. Anyway, that's its own sugya. But I just gave you the background because what the Gemara says is, the Rebbe often quoted this, Godel Talmud, learning is greater, because Talmud, maybe the day Maisa. In the end of the day, you have both. Talmud brings to learning. The Rebbe is going to give us three interpretations of how to understand Talmud, maybe Lidei Ma'aseh. Okay, let's jump into it. Vav. The explanation is like this. The inner pshat, when we say the main thing is not the learning, but the main thing is the deed, it's not just that you need to have both learning and deed. And then we say, which is the main thing? We need learning, we need deed. The deed is the main thing. If you didn't do, you didn't have the thing. No. What we're saying is more than that. The main thing of avodah, of the service of Hashem, is that it should be brought down till the level of deed. Not that there's medrash, there's ma'aseh, and the medrash is not the main thing. That the study is not the main thing. The deed is the main thing. No, he's saying that in the study itself, the main thing is the actualization of it. In other words, even in the ways of serving Hashem, in which one is aloof from the world, it's study, it's not deed. And you're supposed to study, you're supposed to be removed a little bit from the world. The main thing of that study itself is brought to its true fulfillment when it reaches the realm of deed. As our sages tell us, Talmud teaching brings to deed. That's the full achievement of Talmud, of teaching, of learning, brings to deed. doesn't stay in the realm of this esoteric, in the realm of the theoretic. It becomes deed. Let's look. The Rebbe gives us three ways of looking at this. Three ways. Okay. One is that you want to know whether your study was really a true study. Did it hit the spot? Did it get to the essence of what the truth is? So, because intellect has a certain broadness, it can therefore have and contain within it radically different svaras. You can have um, svaras are intellectual arguments, so to speak. You can have an intellectual argument to this side, you can have one to that side. How do you know which one is true? How do you know when you reach the truth? When your final analysis is the way it is according to the psak din, the way the halacha is in actuality, when your understanding leads you to the way the halacha is, then you know that's the truth, right? Because we know Dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem, expresses itself in halacha and what is actually done. So here, what we're saying is, in other words, that the greatness of Talmud, Gadol Talmud Shemem Lemaisa, when is learning really great? When you see that the learning has been at a depth that leads to the way it needs to be done. Then you know your learning you got to the deepest level of learning. You got to the level of learning, which is the true emes, because that's the halacha. That's the way you have to. There's only one halacha. There can be many opinions. The halacha is the way Hashem wants it done here in this world. So learning is great. When is learning great? Learning is great. The type of learning that has brought you to the actual ma'aser, to the actual conclusion, the way it's meant to be done. That's one expression, one way to understand Talmud is great because it leads to ma'aser. In avodas hanefesh, in other words, in the human experience, what does that mean? The proof that a contemplation, for example, contemplating the greatness of man and the low, I'm sorry, sorry, the greatness of God, may he be blessed and may he be elevated, and the lowliness of man, well, there's a contrast, right? How do you know when you really truly got to the bottom of that, understood that, and it really resonated in you? Is when that contemplation brings you to what is called a bechein, a therefore, brings you to a resolution, to a uvechein means and therefore, it brings you to a conclusion of action of okay, therefore it leads you to the next step. It's not just thinking about meditating about and then walk away from the meditation, nothing happened. No, you didn't get to the truth. How do you know when your Talmud is really a proper Talmud, your study is really a proper study? When it brought to deed. Right? So in this way we're interpreting. Godel Talmud. When is your study great? When you see that it brought to an actuality. You reached the halacha. You reached an actual actionable thing from what you studied. Then that's the greatness of Talmud. That's when your learning was great. If it didn't, then your learning wasn't Godel, wasn't great. Second shot that Rebbe says is that the shleimus of Talmud, how do you get to a completion, to a full, the full and deepest level of Talmud of learning is when you know that it's connected with deed. As we see, B'Poel says that in order to decide which of the opposing thoughts in your mind is the correct one, and why do you actually have to? Why is it imperative that you come to a decision which one is the real one? Because 1 second, I got to know what to do. When you need to know what you do, when something becomes relevant in action, so you have to rethink it and relearn it with greater depth till you come to your decision. Which that's why we say that Talmud Gadol learning is greater, because the Talmud brings to deed, which means it's not just that, as we said before, when it leads you to deed, that tells us that the learning was correct. No, it's also telling us that the fact that you know it's going to lead to deed and needs to lead to deed, I need to do something now. That makes you think about it and reach a deeper depth. In other words, the fact that there's a maisa that you need to jump into, that makes your learning greater, makes you need to understand that we all know when something becomes actual, Well, it's theoretical. You can think about it. You get to one level of depth. When something becomes actual now, you need to know, what am I going to do? All of a sudden, you get a deeper understanding and you delve into it deeper because the Maisa pulls you into a deeper Talmud. So, Talmud. Talmud is great when it brings to Maisa because the Maisa is actually pulling and creating a greater depth within you to understand it deeper. However, in both of these ways of explaining the greatness of Talmud, because it brings to Maisa, what have we said? We explained how the Maisa really creates a greatness in the study. It's still talking about the study being great. But in the first thing we said, we're not really excited about the Maisa. We're just saying that in the world of Seichel, we need the Maisa, at least the conclusion. Talmud is great when you reach the right intellectual conclusion. That's the Maisa. It's not actually deed. It's the deed within the thought, within the world of intellect, which means what you think your next step should be in a practical way. Even in the second thing, when we talked that we want to figure out, we know we're going to have to do something, so that makes us think more deeply and have a greater depth in our understanding. So it's just saying that we're highlighting the Talmud. We're saying that the deed brings us to a greater depth in our study. But we're not talking about the greatness of the deed in and of itself. Then there's a third and higher level about that saying Talmud is great because it brings to deed. The Talmud itself, let's try and get this. It's a subtle thing. It says it like this. The Talmud that brings to deed is that the Talmud, the way it is itself, the way the Talmud is in order to is for Maisa. Let me try and get this. The Talmud that brings to deed. The way it is, not for the sake of Talmud, the sake of study, but the way it is for the sake of deed, what that does is it brings down the energy and the light of the seichel itself into the place of deed, which means at the time when he's doing, his deed, at the time of all his deeds, the person is totally permeated with the light of his intellect. It's the deeds of a person who's fully intellectualized. He has. Let's try and explain it as a. The Rabbi gives a footnote here. And the Rabbi gives a footnote like this. A very interesting concept. There's a mitzvah to have simcha on Yom Tov, to have joy. How are you supposed to have joy? The Gemara says the joy we have on simcha, there's wine, and there's joy from the meat. Which meat? Talking about the meat of the karbonis. So I don't understand. What kind of simcha are you supposed to have? You're supposed to have simcha, spiritual simcha. How do you get spiritual simcha? By eating meat? Yeah, does that really bring you spiritual simcha? So here's an interesting thing. The Rebbe sends here to quotes a Maimon of the Alter Rebbe. I look there, I try to understand it. Basically, with Alter Rebbe there says like this. When you bring a carbon, what are we trying to do? We want our physical behema, the animalistic part of us, to have a simcha, to have a spiritual simcha on Yom Tov. What are we going to do? We take the animal that's being brought as a carbon. The carbon that we bring, the meat that brings us simcha on Yom Tov is not just regular meat that we eat today, steaks. But if you like steaks, you can eat it for simcha, but that's not the simcha we're talking about. The simcha we're talking about is the simcha you have, a spiritual simcha, but it's being brought by the carbon, by physical meat. Because you take the animal is partially brought up on the mizbeach, the fats and the blood. What that does is that interacts, that goes to the source of the animal in heaven, which is, as we know, the on the chariot of Hashem, which Hashem is sitting on, so to speak, described by Yecheskel. There's the pnei shor, the face of the bull. So in other words, the behema goes up and reaches its source, becomes incorporated in its source. Part of the behema, part of the animal is left here, and we eat it. But now it's already become a spiritual kind of food. But it's interacting with the physical body, and it creates a physical joy in the animal soul of our body. But because it's a mitzvah meat, because it's carbon, it is literally godly. So even though it's creating a physical pleasure in our physical animalistic part, but it's actually a holy piece of meat. So what you have is you have the physical enjoyment coming together with the spiritual intensity that's in this meat, and it's like one. So you have the highest level, but it's at the same time, it's the same action, the same feeling, the same joy, but it's going on all levels. It's starting in the spiritual realm because it's a carbon, it's a refined, turned into godly piece of meat, which is now interacting with the human body and causing physical pleasure in the human body, joy in the human body, and that it's a joy from above and below, kind of synchronized in total synchronicity. This Rebbe says it's an example. What the Rebbe is here is saying, Gadol Talmud Shemevi Lidei Maisa. What's the greatness of Talmud? The greatness of Talmud is um, greatness of Talmud is when the Talmud is being done for the deed, and what happens is that deed itself is totally imbued with the intensity of and vibrancy of the Talmud, of the actual intellect. It's such a powerful idea. It just kind of let's continue and see how this gets a little clearer. Zion. How can Talmud? Talmud is about your intellect in your head. Study. How can that totally permeate and totally go in the person till he's even vibrant with the intellectual, so to speak, excitement, even in his deed? So the thing is like this: when a Jew is into Talmud, is into his learning only in an external way. So from the external aspects of his nefesh, every koyach, every power, every faculty is limited in its particular boundaries in its particular place. Seichel, intellect, is in the mind. Midas, emotions, are in the heart. Deed, in the hands. You can't have the same time the intellect, and that should be at the same time, so to speak, shining into the deed. And that's why when a Jew is involved in Talmud, so Maisa, from its in terms of its own perspective, Maisa, which is a lot deed, which is a lot lower than intellect, can't really find its place there. What relevance does Maisa have in the world of Talmud? The benefits that Maisa bring to Talmud, as we said, there's a benefit because that's where you know the Talmud is correct. Or when you need to do something practical, your Talmud gets more intensified. But when you're learning the Talmud is still the pnimius of your nefesh, in the innermost aspects of your core. Till that becomes the entire essence and entity of the person. So then there's nowhere in the persona, there's nowhere in the soul, there's nowhere in the person which is in contradiction to his chachma. His chachma is kind of just his totally permeating him. And in this way, it's not just that the Talmud, the learning, has an effect on the Maisa. For that, it would be enough to have, the Rabbi brings here the two midas, netzach and hoid. They are actionable midas. They're called midas levar migufa, outside the main body. They're like the 2 feet. That's um, the actionable um, follow up of seichel. No, but that's separate from the seichel. The Rebbe says no. The seichel has the power. If you have this, the innermost aspect of neshama, of the nefesh involved in the Talmud, it goes through all the levels. The strength of the seichel doesn't become lowered or minimized when the person is also in a mode of Maisa. Rabbi here quotes a lesson of Chassidus that for Meichin de Gadlus, when a person reaches the greatest flow of Meichin, the greatest application of brain, which is being called the Etzem Meichin, the essence of the brain, so then the light of the intellect comes the way it is, and it goes, just shoots through all the levels, all the faculties of man, till the faculties of deed also, which in a lower level really would be separate than Seichel. So according to this, we can understand what the Rambam says, that the same way a chacham, a wise person, is recognizable through his greater sense of chachma. Obviously, a chacham has more chachma than a wise person, more chachma than a regular person. Similarly, he has to be recognizable through his deeds, through his eating, He eats differently, he walks differently, he acts differently. The Rebbe says because a real chacham is that his chacham becomes who he is, it becomes his entire essence. To the point that he is a chacham is able to be recognizable in all of his aspects, in all of his faculties, in the same way. The same way you see it in his chachma, you see it in his external deeds, even when he's busy with deeds. The deeds have no connection to chachma, but it totally comes through with that same intensity. The chachma goes through all the levels till Maisa. Not just you see how chachma had an effect on his Maisa, like two things. One thing has an effect on the other thing. No, you see that his chachma is the essence of who he is, and therefore that's also the way he acts. Not like two separate things. So this, yeah, ches. So we could say that the source of the behavior of the meraglim, the problematic behavior of the meraglim, as we said, it's not that they didn't want deed at all. They didn't want so much Maisa, is because actually it doesn't start in having a problem in not wanting to do Maisa. It starts with the fact that their Talmud, their learning itself wasn't on the highest level. If it would be on the highest level, it would have been permeated all the levels through to deed. They wouldn't see any problem with deed. It's not like a separate thing, it just flow. The Deira, the generation of the desert Darian was Torah. They were called the Deira, a generation of knowledge, of perception of Hashem. They were in the desert, and their learning of Torah was the greatest. They got it from Hashem directly. By the Meraglim, however, the spies, they didn't have it in the perfect way. Because their Talmud, maybe they Maisa, their learning, which should bring to Maisa in the greatest form, that it's like Mechin it's the greatest effectiveness, the greatest of brain, is when the Chachma becomes the whole essence of the person. Even and Maisa is not a problem. There's no barrier between Talmud and Maisa. They didn't reach that. That they could be in the world of Maisa, and yet the light of their Seichel would be in its full strength. And that's why their understanding of Talmud, maybe the name Maisa, was they saw the Maisa as being a distinct thing. And they didn't want to come fully into the world of Maisa, to the world of Deed. They wanted to have Maisa just the way Maisa is in the world of desert. The way Maisa has an effect on Talmud. Right? They didn't want to, because they weren't at a level where their Maisa could be, where their Talmud could just go through their whole essence. And their Maisa, it doesn't matter how much Maisa, would just be an expression of just their full connectivity to the Talmud, to the study of Hashem's Torah. I'm saying words. Obviously, it's very difficult to understand. I don't get it fully, but I hope I'm transmitted a little bit of the concept. According to this, in tests, according to this, we can understand that it didn't start. Their problem wasn't that they had a negativity to deed in total. I said, what was their problem? The problem was their limud, their Talmud was not to the highest degree, which would have just flown into Maisa. So now we can understand what Rabbi Yitzchak was saying. We don't have, all we have is one of the Meraglim. What is he saying? In the earlier generations, obviously, our forefathers were in the desert. Their avodah, their main service was in the head. So they needed to know all the names of the 12 Meraglim, all the nuances of how to learn properly, how not to fall into the mishap of the Meraglim. And because in Avodas Hashem and the service of Hashem, there's so many differences. Each tribe is different, right? We know each tribe has its path and its nuance, its style in Avodas Hashem. So you would need, in the earlier generations where they were more into Talmud, you would need to know the individual names of the Meraglim, so you could be able to guard yourself from the from the different styles of mistake. However, in later times, after we've passed the time which the Gemara says, if the earlier ones were like angels, then we are like people. We talk about even the times that the Gemara spoke, that their generations were diminished in terms of their spiritual stature. Especially when we talk about that the Sukkah David, the Sukkah of David, the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, and now what we call about that the Sukkah of David fell, means that it's at the level of feet and heels, which is the level of deed. The main thing is deed, Maisa of mitzvahs. Says Rabbi Yitzchak, it's not so relevant to know about all the nuances of the mistakes of the Meraglim, the way it was in its source about Talmud, that their learning was somehow not at the greatest, deepest level. Because that that's not so relevant to us. That's not where we're holding. We're holding more in the realm of Maisa. What we have to know is the result of that was how that resulted in a lacking in the observance of mitzvahs doing Torah, because we need to know what's relevant to all of us in the world of deed. What happened through their mistake? What happened that is one lesson that all of us can relate to in the world of deed, because that's our world today. We're not like the Rishonim, we're not like the early generations. Even the Gemara is saying, we're not like the early. They had a tradition. The earlier generations had a tradition for every one of the names of Meraglim. That's in the world of Torah. In the world of Maisa, says Rabbi Yitzchak, we didn't get in our hands except for one. In other words, not that we don't know, but what's relevant to us in our hands, what's relevant to us from the names of Meraglim, is just one thing. Elo echad. There's kind of one basic theme that we need to take from this mistake. What is it? And that's for all the Jews in all generations without any distinction. What is it? Oh, we see this in the word Sesur b'micha. Sesur means he contradicted the deeds of Hashem. What is the deeds of Hashem? The Eibishter Hashem created the world of deed maisim. That what? That the intention of the world is that the Jews should build. They should build, make a dwelling place for Hashem. And therefore, through not doing mitzvahs, indeed, yeah, if that is not made as the main thrust of the Avodah, so what you're doing is you're destroying, you're contradicting, and taking apart the deed of Hashem. So from the demolition. You're taking apart the world of Hashem, the deed of Hashem. In other words, Hashem's world of Maisa becomes, God forbid, disturbed. It's not built up. It's demolished. It's lacking. More than this, similar to what Chazal tell us, any generation that the Beis Hamikdash is not built in its days, it's as if it was destroyed in its days. So, in other words, the main thing we got to learn is, hey, if we're not doing Maisa, if the deed of mitzvahs is not the main focus of our Aveda, then we're sesur. We're taking apart, so to speak, the deeds of Hashem, the world of deed of Hashem. You could ask, since Hashem created the world with that intention, Hashem is able to do everything and nobody can stop him. How can a Yid, a Jew, who's a created being, how can he contradict or destroy, take apart the world of Hashem and not allow the kavanah, the intention of Hashem, to come to its fulfillment in the world of deed? Square brackets. If you would say that Hashem's kavanah didn't come out in speech, right? It only was Hashem's thought, so to speak. So you could say, since Hashem's will is still only in his thought, and thought is higher in our world, thoughts are not known to somebody else. So we have that parallel in Hashem, so to speak. It's something that's unknown to us, and therefore it doesn't force us in any particular way. It doesn't have to be. Right? Hashem leaves it to our choice because he hasn't, so to speak, made it an imperative. He hasn't said it yet. It's only, so to speak, in Hashem's thought. Still not actualized. However, since we know that the will of Hashem, that we should work with the Aveda of Maisa, deeds of mitzvahs, is expressed begolui, in a revealed way, in the instructions Hashem gave us. Hashem gave us instructions of mitzvahs in speech. So we know that the speech of Hashem is just like deed. In other words, Hashem has created a fact by speaking that the world has to be sustained through the doing. So how can a Jew who's only a created being undo that? Hashem's permanence through speech and deed. The answer to that is because how can there be sesur? How can there be a demolition, so to speak, of Hashem's world, the world of deed, of mitzvahs? Is because sesur is ben Michael, is a son of Michael. In other words, is a result of who? Michael. That Hashem made himself moch. Hashem made himself as if he's low. What does it mean in an inner explanation is? That we're talking not just about what the Meraglim did, that they made Hashem, chas v'shalom, low. No, we're saying that Hashem made himself low, so to speak, kaviyachol. In order a Jew should be able to have free choice, so Hashem made himself kaviyachol, made himself low and weak, that his speech should not create an imperative, right, and force the action of man. Hashem made himself, so to speak, powerless to stop the action of man that goes against him. He gives the power to, God forbid, to be able to do the opposite of what he wants, to be able to say, to be able to take apart his world of deed. And so, what is the thing we have to? What is the thing? What is the thing we have to be careful of? Not to be sasur, not to go against Hashem's world, which is the deed that we have to do Ma'aseh mitzvahs, because we're able to do that because He made Himself low. He made Himself, gave us, so to speak, the ability to do that. Yud says the Rebbe, we can make a toss. Person could think that the only thing that we have to worry about in our generations, after we said the Aviseinu, our forefathers, the higher generations, they had 12 aspects that were. We just have one thing. We got to do deed. The deed is the main thing. Says Rabbi Yochanan, we also don't need something else. Afonu, we also will say that there's another thing. What is that? Nachbi. The spy called Nachman Babsi, that he hid the words of Hashem. What does that mean? We also need to make sure not to hide the words of Hashem, because the words of Hashem, not just the speech, the words will lead us to make sure that the speech is proper, that the deed is proper. What is the word of Hashem? The word of Hashem is the fact that Hashem creates constantly through His word. The Dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem, is what is enlivening every single creation, every single deed of Hashem. We have to make sure we don't hide those words. In other words, our deeds need to be in a way that we are cognizant and aware of the word of Hashem, which is enlivening deed. Because as we've spoken, it's not enough just deed. The deeds need to be alive. They need to be illuminated. The Rebbe says, like we've spoken many times, in order that the dwelling place of Hashem in the world of deed that the Jewish people build should be in the world of deed, should be an illuminated one. In other words, it shouldn't just be empty deeds, but the deeds should be a light. They should be illuminated in a revealed way. That requires that the deeds, the actions of a Yid need to be light. In other words, they need to be illuminated. That you feel in whatever he's doing, the word of Hashem. That the word of Hashem is what enlivens them. And therefore you do the service of Hashem with chayis. In other words, there needs to be inspiration. There needs to be it's not just empty deed. There needs to be a vibrancy to the deeds, an inspiration to the deeds that you get from understanding that Hashem is constantly creating the world. And where does it come that you could hide that aspect and not be aware of the presence of Hashem and just do dry deeds? It's a result of vavsi. What's vavsi? Jumping over the midas of Hashem. Could be that by a Jew that be chas v'shalom, how could a Jew get to hide the words of Hashem and not, in other words, not see and not get excited about Hashem who's enlivening the world at all times? Is because sometimes you could jump over. Piseh means jump over the work of midas. Our midas, working on our midas, on our attributes, developing emotional feelings for Hashem, which our midas come as a result of the midas above. This can create a problem that we don't truly appreciate, the fact that Hashem is enlivening the world at all times, and therefore our deed won't be a vibrant deed. Through arousing an ahava to Hashem, the midas, arousing a love to Hashem, so then the revelation of the godly light in our soul, which is still higher than the world, we still haven't engaged in the world, but getting inspired by that ahava to Hashem, we're going to get this light of Hashem from higher than the world, and that gives the koyach that even when we go in and engage in the world, it's not going to be as if we're hiding or as if we're not noticing the presence of Hashem in everything we're doing. So it's deed, but deed that's alive, that's powered and sparked by an awareness of Hashem that comes from the love of Hashem. Through this, we'll understand also what it says. Rabbi Yochanan said, he said, no, not Rabbi Yitzchak. You said we have one thing. So we too will say. What does it mean? We too will say. The fact that the Meraglim were hiding the words of Hashem came from the fact that they wanted to stay in the world of deed. The world of machshava. Well, there, the world of Achshava, the thought, you have the higher level of Hashem, the thought of Hashem, so to speak. They don't want to come down to the world of speech. The world of speech, and where you see the speech of Hashem, the way it creates the created being. So that the speech of Hashem in the world of Meraglim, they didn't want to go down there, it would remain hidden. So that's why you get Nachbi ben Vafsi, because they wanted to jump over, the Meraglim wanted to jump over the level of Hashem's midas, the way Hashem enlivens the world. They didn't want to go down that low. So therefore, they wanted to go straight to the world of Machshava, which comes before the world. Yeah. But we, says Rabbi Yochanan, we want to not be like that. We don't want to be like Nachmi ben Vafsi, where we're missing the midas of Hashem. On the contrary, we want to make sure they wanted to stay in thought, but we have to be careful of the other extreme, not to get caught up only in deed and skip the aspect of midas. So that's why he says, Anu, we also have to have the avodah of Nachmi ben Vafsi, not to jump over the midas work, the illuminating work, the inspirational work, to make sure that our deeds are imbued with feeling. Yud base. A Yid could say, Taka in the later generations, we have to do not just Maisa, not just Yid, we also have to do the internal service of our minds and heart, to become engaged in our minds and hearts. However, since we are in the generation of feet and heels, so the Avodah is not with an emes, because we don't have such an ability to really engage our seichel, and we don't have the ability to get to the raw intellect, so to speak, and the deepest emotional, because our whole context, our whole generations are in a context of feet level. So even the seichel and the midas that we have are, so to speak, in a feet level. They're not at the highest level. So how can we, through our service for Hashem, create the perfect dwelling place for Hashem? We don't have that capacity in these generations. Because we're on a lower level. As we said, in order to create the perfect dwelling place for Hashem, you need not just deed, you also need the work of Talmud, which enlightens, vivifies the world of deed. So the explanation of that is, since all Yidden of all generations, all the Jewish people from all generations are like one body, so it starts from, I guess, from Har Sinai, whatever, and till now, we're all like one complete body. So that means that whatever they did in the previous generations, in their minds and heart, it's the mind and heart of our service too, because we're the same body, we're the continuation of the same body. We're the feet of that body, of that mind and heart that did what it had to do. And so therefore, our activity in deed of mitzvahs, in a hidden way, we have the intentionality of the intellect and the emotion that the previous generations had. It's part of us. And that's what Rabbi Yitzchak said right in the beginning. Rabbi Yitzchak said, right, this thing is Masayres B'Yadena. It's a tradition in our hands from our fathers, that the Meraglim are called according to their names. Taka, says the Rebbe, learns like this. Taka loy also B'Yadena. We have in our hands only one. We only have to worry about deed. But you want to know about our forefathers? That's Masayres B'Yadena. We have that tradition. It's been handed into our hands, so to speak. It's been given over to us. And also, it's given over to us, but in a hidden way, and it doesn't rise to the top, so to speak. It doesn't rise from the golus and the concealment that we have in these generations. We don't have access to it in a revealed way. And therefore, in practicality, we have one thing we have to worry about: deed. But we do have handed over to us in a hidden way, at least, the greatest levels of machshava as well. And therefore, through our avodah maisa, we have completed the kavana of doing making Hashem a dir b'tachtonim, because we have the avodah that was done before us, and we have our avodah maisa.